Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen W. Long. This is The Writing Life. And, I was thinking again, I think I've mentioned this before, the community that we're in, McMinnville and the surrounding area, is such a supportive community for the arts. And in fact, this show is supported by Arts Alliance of Yamhill County. But there's, whether it's fine art or writing, dance, and so on, there's just a lot of support. And I think an example of that for writing is we have an annual contest, it's 25 years now, called Paper Gardens. And I feel just tickled to have with us Lisa Ohlen Harris, who is this year's prose judge, and just a fabulous writer in her own right. So welcome first.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah. And you and I had a little bit of a conversation before. You said you've not done this before. That is the judging part. Mm-hmm. And I wondered, because I think you and I agree that this is pretty subjective. And so I wondered, what are you looking for? Or do you even know?
Right.
Do you just wait for it to strike you?
Right. Well, of course, I haven't seen any entries yet
Sure.
because we haven't had our deadline come around yet. In
Right.
fact, I'm not even sure if we have submissions. But when we do, when everything's done, I will get a batch of them.
Okay.
And I will start going through them, and I'll read each and every one of them, and I'll sort them into piles, I think. And the ones that are interesting to me, the ones that capture me, go in one pile,
Right.
and the ones that I'm not sure about go in another. And probably, the capture me pile will be pretty thick at first, and
Sure.
then I'll go through and pare down and pare down and pare down.
Try it again.
And I really like to say I don't know what I'm looking for, because then I'm open to be surprised and to
Right.
be pleased, which actually kind of tells you what I'm looking for. I
Right.
would like to be delighted. I would like to be pleased or shocked, or
Right.
I want to come across something, even that I say, whoa, I have never seen anything like this before,
Yeah.
in a good way, or a surprising way, or even a shocking way.
Right.
And in fact, just on the drive down here from Newburgh, I was thinking, what about, one of the questions I had when I used to enter contests myself was,
Right.
what about that typo I found after I sent it off to the contest?
Sure.
Is the judge going to knock me out because of that? And I thought, a typo, no, or some commas that shouldn't be there,
Right.
or missing where they should, not a problem. But when you have those glaring errors, a lot of them on the first page, then you enter into the realm of sloppiness. And that even if the judge says, I'm not going to say no to this manuscript because
Right.
of this, it still sort of gives a feeling. So, and I guess I'm responding as a writer, having not done the judging, but
Yes.
as a writer, I think, I want my manuscript to be as clean as it can possibly be,
Right.
so that the work is what the judge is going to read, and that the typos or the way that the work is conveyed becomes just a lens that's nice and clear and polished,
Right.
and you can actually see the work.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know this about me, Steve, but I was the nonfiction editor of a literary journal for several years.
I knew that you were and are an editor, because you've helped me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so no, tell us about the other.
So I started writing in about 2004, and within about a few years, I was working as a reader
Okay.
for a literary journal called Relief Journal, which I believe is still in existence today.
Okay.
And in 2007, I moved from a reader into being a shared nonfiction editor, and then I was the solo nonfiction editor for 2 more years after that. I left in 2010. So I do, even though I haven't judged a contest, I have taken those submissions to the literary journal and done that sorting. And in my case, with the work that I was going to publish, I often worked with the author on either small elements or
Okay.
sometimes more significant, sometimes a rewrite to get that ready for publication.
I didn't know this about you, and so as you said that, I was thinking, let me back up a little bit. One of the ways that I was taught to critique, like if you're in a critique group, is to pretend that you're the editor of the publication, and you've already accepted this thing, they've got their money, and now your job is to make it better. So if you say, and again, have you been in a critique group? Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's not helpful when you're sitting around the table to say, this doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
Well, what good is that?
Yeah.
So, but you're trying to find a way to make it better. And that's apparently that's how you worked with your writers.
Right, right.
Yeah.
With those pieces that were selected. Yeah, the
Right.
critique group is an interesting thing to talk about, actually. I had a mentor, Judith Kitchen, who has passed on now.
Okay.
But she used to say, a manuscript is not a menu. You don't get to say, I didn't like this, and I want more of that.
Okay.
You're not at the restaurant,
Sure,
ordering here.
Sure. And can
But
I have that on the side?
Yeah, yeah, right. Well, maybe you want that, but maybe that's not what the chef is making today.
Right,
And
right.
just because it's your taste doesn't mean that's what the
Yeah.
intention of the menu is. But I think it's an interesting thought to say, okay, imagine that this piece, you've already accepted it, you're going to publish it.
Right.
Because that sort of takes away, I think, the inclination sometimes in a critique group to show off your knowledge and that
Right.
you can spot what's wrong with something and
Yeah.
but rather to have a view of hope and promise and
Sure.
possibility for the piece. I have not actually heard that before, but that's an
Yeah.
interesting and probably helpful
I think
way
it
to
was
go.
helpful for me, and I want to say too, in one of, I've been in a couple of really terrific critique groups. In one of them, I had a fellow student, Patricia Smiley, has had some real success with writing. And I think that when you're in a critique group, I think you shouldn't bring your work in before you're fairly solid, and so that you kind of know what you want. And the reason I say that is, if there's 6 people in there, you're going to get 5 opinions. And if you don't know what you want, you can't follow everybody. So, and the reason I bring up Patty, she was working on her first novel, and somebody would offer a suggestion, and she would politely sit there and listen to it. And when it was her turn to speak, she would say, "That's a great idea. It's not for this book, but it's a great idea." Because she was solid. She knew what she was
wanted.
trying to do. Now,
Yeah.
conversely, sometimes somebody will say something, at least this happens to me, and I will have had a nagging feeling about a weakness. Yeah, this emotion isn't true, or whatever the problem is. And somebody will call me on it, and I'll say, "You're right. You're right. I kind of felt that, but now you've shown a spotlight on it, and you're right."
Right.
Yeah.
So do you think there's a difference, though, in a critique group, whether you're bringing chapters in an ongoing, larger work in progress, or you're bringing a short story?
Yes.
Because I have found it really helpful to bring work that can be malleable, that can be changed. When I bring something that I feel like is fairly ready and I know where it's going, I'm not really open to that more developmental kind of
Right.
possibilities.
Right. That's a good question.
But that's with a smaller, standalone sort of piece.
Sure.
Because with a larger piece, you know the context, and maybe your critique group knows the context if they've been with you, but nobody knows it as well as you do, as well as the writer.
I think with a something that's serialized or episodic, they may be more inclined to give you a break. Again, it depends on what the problem is, or what they perceive as the problem. If they're willing to hang back and say to themselves, at least, I don't know, let's see where this goes.
Yeah.
But with a shorter piece, you've kind of got the whole thing, so you know where it goes.
Right, that's
Yeah.
true. That's true. I have found really helpful the kind of feedback that is, I don't know if this is the right term for it, this is what I say, but reader response, where the people in the critique group will just, or the person who's reading your work will just say, in this paragraph, here's what I felt, or this made me think of this other thing, or I don't know if this is what you're going for, but I made this connection, or
Right.
did you notice that you have water showing up in different ways in 5 different places, where they're not giving a diagnosis, they're not saying the water should really become a motif and you
Right,
need to do
right.
this. They're just observing, which leaves you to make the decision and to say, oh, I did mean for that to be there, but I meant for it to be a lot bigger. I meant for
Right.
you to know that I wanted that there,
Right.
so I need to make that bigger.
Yeah.
And actually, I've learned to do that kind of responding from poets.
Okay.
And I don't know if it's a poet thing or if just the particular poets that I know have done that,
Yeah.
but that is something, and it's really the way I can respond to poetry, because I don't know poetry, I don't always get poetry, but I can say, this made me feel this way, this made me think this, I don't know what this is doing.
Right.
And ends up being helpful.
I think that's great, and poetry, I think, lends itself to that because it's such condensed language. I don't want to say that you can get away with things in a novel or a longer piece, but I think in poetry you have to admit every word is critical and thematically and so on.
Sure, but that kind of reader response is helpful, I think, even for a prose writer to hear.
Oh, definitely.
Not every paragraph or every line,
Right.
necessarily, or anything like that.
Right.
But I'm kind of playing with this idea, and I don't really know if I'm on the right track, but I've been hearing a term coming up, glossing. And we use the term like, oh, just gloss over it. Or a glossary in the back of the book gives you the definitions of some of the words, right? So glossing would be, if I'm understanding it correctly, I don't know, but would be making marginal comments that are defining some of the things in the text, like in a research paper or something. So I'm playing with this idea that glossing, or a creative form of glossing, would be writing in the margin of a work what you see happening, what connections you're making, that sort of reader response, and then handing that over to the writer. I mean, I'm in my work as a developmental editor.
Sure.
This is something I'm wondering if that could be helpful, or in a critique group sort of setting. And so it's just like, I can't believe I'm saying this out loud to another writer, because it's just this speck of an idea that I have, but I'm wondering if that could go somewhere, and if that could be a helpful concept. And if I have the right idea about what glossing is, I'm not sure yet. I need to do more reading
and
about
so I
that.
think, whatever the term is, the idea, the concept is the right concept.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you, your writing, I think, is completely, or at least primarily, nonfiction.
Yes, exclusively nonfiction.
Okay. But with what you just talked about, really you could apply that to fiction or nonfiction.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And I do end up doing a little bit of reading of fiction because I teach classes for Southern New Hampshire University's online master's program.
Okay.
I teach a publishing class, I teach an editing class, I teach nonfiction thesis courses. And in the publishing and editing, not in the publishing class, in the editing class, we're using samples of the students' work to practice editing.
Okay.
So even though I'm not an expert, in fiction editing or anything, I'm still seeing these students' work, I'm reading these students' work, and I do see, okay, it's not so different as I might think that it is, between fiction and nonfiction.
Think so.
Yeah.
And that's a good segue. I love your books, and you really have a style, I think. Is that something that you're even conscious of?
I don't
It's just
think
how
so.
you write, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's just how I write, and it's how I write once I've revised and once I know what I'm going to say.
Okay.
Because in my drafts are often so clunky and so strange, and almost as if I'm writing notes to myself. And I don't bother to make it sound like me or try to make it sound articulate until I know I have the shape of a piece. Because I'm sure you had this experience as an emerging writer where you get that paragraph really, really perfect, that first paragraph, and then you move on to the second paragraph. And by the time you finish the whole chapter or story, you go back and remove that first paragraph that you worked so hard on and made so beautiful. So I think of it as, slapping clay on the form. And I slap on a bunch of clay, but I'm not going to start really shaping it or really, getting that eyebrow exactly right until I know that this book is going to have an eyebrow at all.
Right. Well, and I think that's good advice. So let me restate that, because I've gone through this myself and talked to other people about this. And that is, when you're writing, don't rewrite. Just write. Just get through it. Because, in fact, I'll give you another example. An author, T. Jefferson Parker, when he started writing, and he's had some real success. His first book was, I think, Laguna Heat, which he was, at the time, simultaneously with doing this, he was a reporter for the Orange County Register, and sort of at night wrote this thing. Well, he says the way that he started was he would just sit down and write the book. Take that manuscript, put it in the drawer, and never look at it again.
Yeah.
By the time he wrote that first draft, really, with no revision, he said, then I knew where I was going. Then I could come back and write that.
Yeah.
So he's done it.
Yeah.
A little
But then
different.
there's the problem of getting overwhelmed if you create so much of a draft that you can't see the shape of it because it's so big. then you can sort of get lost in
I
it.
suppose it's, different people like outline. I mean, I don't so much, but
Yeah, there's no one size fits all, right?
you were talking about the clay, and something that I've done when I get stuck is I'll talk to myself on the screen.
How do you mean?
I will say, well, you've got John going to the park. What in the world is he going to do there?
Okay.
Or why is this important?
Yeah,
Or I
yeah.
will just, it's not the story. I'm just talking to myself, but I'm doing it, I don't know if physically, if it makes a difference through your fingers and then you see it on the screen. But it seems to me that it does, or at
Do you
least
do
it
that
does for
within
me.
the manuscript that you're working on, or do you open a separate file
I
to
have
do
a separate
that?
file.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and I just talk to myself.
Yeah.
And I try to work out, as if I was talking to somebody else, but work out where's it going, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
Not so much things like voice, because that, to me, that voice is really important. If you can hear it, if I can hear it, then that really helps me write. And I think my style is more literary, so it's less
Definitely.
about plot and more about
Right.
character.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But tell us about yours. Now, set up the whole thing. I know you were out of the country. Okay, go ahead and,
Okay.
yeah.
So this, you're talking about Through the Veil, which
Yeah.
is I call it my Middle East memoir.
Okay.
But it's actually a series of essays. So each chapter in Through the Veil stands alone, almost like a short story. Only in nonfiction we would call that a personal essay.
Okay.
Not a 5-point academic essay, And this is also literary stuff. And so basically, the first half of the book is about the just 3 months that I lived in Damascus, Syria as a graduate student doing ethnographic research. And each chapter breaks into an account of a different Muslim woman that I met while I was there. And that 3 months in Damascus, this was in 1990, so it was before the Civil War.
Right.
Syria was still, a dictatorship. It was still a third world kind of place, but more peaceful, not entirely peaceful, but more peaceful, and the infrastructure was still intact in a beautiful, Roman ruins that you walk through on your way from the bazaar to your home in the old walled city, and just beautiful amount of history. And the culture is so welcoming. So we were there to figure out what are the different people groups in Syria. Palestinians, I now can name some of them, Turkomans, Circassians. You walk into the city, it's just this mass of Muslims, right? And probably you think they're Arab Muslims, but as you begin to talk to people and meet them, you learn they're from all different places, or even if they're from Damascus, sometimes for generations, they still have this strong ethnic identity, and they may not even intermarry with those who don't share that ethnic identity.
But as an outsider, they all look the same
Well,
to you. Or at
not
least at first.
anymore. I mean,
Yeah,
not
yeah.
after 3 months of research, but yes,
Right.
at first, it's just a Muslim country, And so we would walk down the street, and we 2 by 2 with our research partner, and we would just come up to people and say, "Do you speak English?" And we figure we have a 50-50 chance because a second language is compulsory in the education system there. So it's either going to be French or English. And it's such a hospitable culture. I can't even tell you how many times someone would say, shui shui, and would go and bring somebody who spoke English.
Oh, boy.
Or send you down the street to the other shop owner who spoke English. And many, many times, probably nearly every day, I was invited home to someone's house for lunch. And that was really great, being in a culture where Muslim women are not 100%, but many of them covered up on the streets, sometimes really covered up, which is another sign of the different ethnographic groupings. A woman with her whole face covered and a coat and gloves, she's from a different subculture and probably a different ethnic group than the woman who just has a scarf on and maybe her sleeves only go to here. And you start to see these differences. But to walk in a Muslim home, and if there are no men home who are unrelated to the women, to see them just shed these scarves and shed the coats and really become themselves and have such a feeling of freedom was a wonderful privilege, an amazing thing, really, and one of the
experience.
things I write about. So that's the first half of the book.
Yeah.
Well, I met my husband as part of this graduate student
Okay.
tour, and we got married.
And was he a student as well?
He was a student as
Okay.
well. He was doing research as well. And we came back, we dated, we got married, and we went back to Amman, Jordan, 2 or 3 years later to do language study, to actually study Arabic. We had a like once or twice a week little conversation class while we were in Damascus, and we joked at the time that we had taxi Arabic. We could say, go straight, turn left, stop here, thank you. But so the second half of the book is about my life in Jordan, which became much more of a life in the home because I went there with one child, had 2 more children while I was there. I did study Arabic while I was there, but my life was still much more home-based. But again, the chapters break down into not always a Muslim woman in each chapter, but a friendship with Muslims or an event in our lives. So it becomes a memoir in essays, even though there's the narrative of just the chronology of having lived in this place.
Well, when I read it, I felt that
it was a
I mean,
memoir.
it felt like a narrative to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But by contrast, my second book is much more begins at this point and goes all the way through to another point. And it did start out in essays. The way that I wrote it, chapter by chapter, was the only way I knew how to write at the time, was in essays. And some of these chapters felt more like a standalone piece that could be publishable than others. But I really had faith in this project, and I just kept writing them. And this was my master's thesis, my MFA thesis.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then put them together at the end, and then went through and started looking at it as one larger narrative or book, and started taking out all the repetition and making sure that the threads went throughout, and adding and subtracting. And I think when I graduated with my master's degree, this was about 50,000 words. I worked on it for the following not quite year, and it came up to about 65. I started submitting it. Once I got a contract with a publisher, then I had further editing and revision to do. I brought it back down to 60,000 and up to 68.
Really?
And that's where it stands here. So it was my master's thesis, but it's a very different manuscript than my thesis manuscript.
Okay. Yeah. So, like I say, this was new to me. I didn't know. I thought that this was more almost like a diary or something.
Yeah. Well, it feels like a diary. The way that it's written,
personal.
and yeah, I think so. So when I say master's thesis, this was an MFA program, Master of Fine Arts.
Right.
So your thesis in an MFA program is going to be a creative work. It's going to be a novel or a memoir or an essay collection or a poetry collection. It's not a research piece like you might have, in another graduate program.
So, was this what was sort of the springboard to editing, or did you pursue that?
I actually was an editor before I was a writer.
Okay.
I got married in 1991 here, or down in Corvallis, and we moved to Philadelphia right away.
Oh.
And I looked for a job. And I had been working with international students at OSU, just as in administration, running cultural programs, and you could do that with just a bachelor's degree. But at Drexel and University of Pennsylvania, at the universities in Philadelphia, you couldn't. You needed a master's degree to do anything. Well, I was not ready to get a master's, wasn't interested in that. So I was working almost like a student kind of job. I was sitting with the graduate students, entering things in the computer. I wasn't in the classroom. I wasn't with students. And it wasn't full time. And so I kept looking for work, and I ended up working with a radio program. And I ended up, I was just an administrative assistant, but I ended up being shifted into being a managing editor of a little monthly devotional that they put out as a companion to the radio broadcast, and did some other editing there. And so I really sort of came into it because those were my gifts, and my boss saw those gifts. And
yeah, I was going to say.
So I was an editor, but it wasn't because I dreamed of editing. In fact, at that point in my life, I really didn't love being in front of a computer screen. Now,
yeah, a little different.
I love being by myself and with some writing. That's great. But at the time, I really wanted more to be with people and not so much on the computer. So that was my start. I did a little bit of freelance work as I had children, dissertation, that sort of thing. And then it wasn't until about 2007 when I came back into and had started writing that I returned to editing and was doing more creative stuff at that point. But I already knew, style manuals. I already kind of knew some of the terms used in editing. I knew proofreaders' marks and that sort of thing. So I'm not sure whether I started editing in 2008 or I continued
Right.
editing in 2008.
Okay, so how about now? And the reason that I ask the people who see this, are you available to do that?
Yes,
Yeah,
I am.
I thought so.
Yeah, so I cobble together things to make my writing life work because, like you, writing books has not, I assume, writing a book, having a book out does not, pay the bills. It is a wonderful thing and very satisfying, but I also need to augment that
Sure.
with other things that are compatible with my writing life. So I teach online, I teach some on ground. I taught a class through Word Studio last year.
Right, I
I
remember.
think we're going to be getting some more Word Studio classes going
Good.
in the near future, so that's something
Yeah.
to watch for sure. And in addition to that, I work doing both copy editing and developmental editing. Do you know those terms? You know that, or do
Copy
our
editing, I
listeners
do.
know?
In fact,
so-
define both because maybe there's somebody
Yeah.
that's even less knowledgeable than
Right.
me.
So, and I didn't know, any of this
Yeah.
not that long ago. So, copy editing is, I think, what most of us think of when we think of what the editor does.
Right.
The copy editor is going to take a manuscript and clean it up.
Right.
Going to fix those commas. Going to make sure that all of the times that you spell a name, they're spelled correctly every single time.
At least the same.
That there aren't odd repetitions. They're going to keep you from getting embarrassed.
Right.
And sometimes real intensive copy editing might even suggest changes in syntax to make something flow more smoothly.
Okay.
But as you're talking about moving around chunks and really changing things in the writing, like what your critique group might be
Right.
suggesting to do, that becomes developmental. And there are actually editors out there who work developmentally with their clients. So you put the copy editing aside. This is a later phase, but when that manuscript is still being formed,
That's kind of the last thing then.
the copy editing.
Yeah.
Yes,
Put-
absolutely.
move the comma. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and that's sometimes what ends up happening in a critique group is this nitpicky stuff
Which
that
is
really,
not
if the
helpful.
shape of the story
Yeah.
isn't there, that
Right.
doesn't matter. So, a developmental editor will take a look at your story or your essay and will say, "This is working great. This is a great hook. You know what? The second paragraph is where it really starts to grip.
Right.
Why don't you think about moving that and bringing it up first?" So the essay of yours that I looked at, I don't know, a year or two ago, those were developmental notes that I
Right.
gave you on that, where it is subjective, Steve, and that's the weird thing about it, is that it's not like there's some platonic ideal of a humor essay, and I'm
Sure.
going to give you the components to plug in to make
Follow
your
this
piece
formula
fit.
and it'll be great.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are formulas out there,
Well.
but we're not interested in that, right?
Right.
So there is this subjective sense, but that subjective opinion or my aesthetic is formed out of the reading I do, out of the writing I do, and out of how the piece speaks to me
Sure.
as well. And a lot of times I am right on the money, So one of the things that I tell my clients, and this is just a really simple thing, but that closing section in your short story or in your book, you want that last line to sing, right? Famous last words. You remember the last word somebody said before they're
Sure.
gone. So you want your last word to really, really resonate. And that's also true on a chapter level and even on a paragraph level. So if you're writing something about your neighbor came over and she had a cup of tea with you, and as she looked out the window, she saw a bird singing. She said, "Oh, doesn't that bird sing in a beautiful way?" And she was just sitting there gazing out the window. So as you write that sentence, if you have and she remarked how clearly the bird sang, and she sat there in the chair. Well, chair
Yeah.
is not real evocative.
Right.
And it's, there's got to be something going on than just the bird singing, like her husband just died, say, right? So if you switch that sentence around so that you have something more evocative in the ending, so it becomes, she sat in the chair and looked out the window and remarked on how beautifully the birds sang. Then at least your last image, the last words are the birds sang. And that is a totally lame example, but you get the idea.
I do, yeah.
That the striking, the thing that's the image, the part of the sentence that's the, I think it was Roland Barthes who talked about the wound, the part that really moves you. Get that to the end if you can, especially
Sure.
if you have a kind of a drizzling off ending. And you can move the syntax around, and the syntax can even be a little off. There's Sarah Vole is an essayist, and she played the voice of Violet on The Incredibles. She
Oh.
has kind of a nasally voice. She
Okay.
does essays on NPR with David Sedaris, humorous stuff, and she has an essay in her collection called Assassination Vacation, and she goes to all these sites where people were assassinated, like Lincoln, for example. And I don't remember if this is that book or another one, but in one of her essays about Lincoln, maybe the Gettysburg Address, at the very end of the essay, she talks of something about President Lincoln, and her last line is, "Him we love." And she did exactly that. She took the word love, because we would usually say we love him.
We love him.
But she took that poetic license, that poetic phrasing, and moved love to be the last sentence. And it is the closing phrase of the essay. So even though it's awkward syntax, it still works to bring us a more evocative word. Sometimes you can make your readers feel something just by the way you move your words around, even when the content may not.
There's a famous quote that I cannot remember precisely, except what it says is, and this is about poetry, I don't understand it, but it moves me.
Yeah.
Now, it was said much more elegantly, but that was the gist of it. And we are out of time. And this went way too fast.
Yeah, it did.
So can you come back sometime?
I would love to.
Yeah, we got more to talk about.
Okay.
So thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, folks, that's it for this time. Oh, you know, one more thing. Do you have a website? How can people get hold
Yeah,
of you?
LisaOhlenHarris.com.
Okay, you got that, Caroline? Yeah, let's show that. But anyway, so thank you for joining us. Gosh, we'll be back, and I hope Lisa can come back with us. So I'll see you next time on The Writing Life. Thank you so much.
What do you think? We done?
I don't know, you guys wanna do one just with yourself without me doing the
As long as they think we're done, if they got enough, they got enough.
They got enough? Probably, okay, sounds good.
Let's go lunch. I'm hungry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could use a bite too.